Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of the Memoirs of General Rapp. Chapter 19.
Meanwhile, the negotiations for peace were proceeding very slowly, and Germany was still suffering. A young man, instigated by a blind feeling of patriotism, formed the design of delivering his country from him whom he regarded as the cause of its misfortunes. He presented himself at Schönbrunn on the 23rd October while the troops were defiling. I was on duty. Napoleon was standing between the Prince de Neufchâtel and me. The young man, who was named Saint, advanced to the emperor. Berthier, conceiving that he was about to present a petition, stepped forward and told him to deliver it to me. He replied that he wished to speak to Napoleon, but he was again told that if he had any communication to make, he must apply to the Aide-de-Camp on duty. He withdrew to a short distance, repeating that he would speak with Napoleon only. He came forward again and approached very near the person of the emperor. I drew him back and told him in German that he must withdraw, that if he had anything to solicit, he would be heard after the parade. His right hand was thrust into a side pocket under his great coat, and he held a paper, one end of which was visible. I was struck with the expression of his eyes when he looked at me. His decided manner roused my suspicions. I called to an officer of gendarmerie who was on the spot, and ordered him to be put under arrest and conducted to the castle. The attention of everyone present was so occupied with the parade that nobody noticed what was going forward. I was soon after informed that a large carving knife had been found on Saint. I told Duroc what I had learnt, and we went together to the place to which he had been conducted. We found him sitting on a bed, on which were laid the portrait of a young female, a portfolio, and a purse containing a few old louis d'or. I asked his name. "I can tell it only to Napoleon," was his reply. "What did you intend to do with the knife that was found upon you?" "That I can tell only to Napoleon." "Did you propose to assassinate him?" "Yes, sir." "Why? That I can tell only to him." I went to communicate this singular circumstance to the emperor. He desired that the young man might be conducted to his closet. I went out to give this order, and on my return I found Bernadotte, Berthier, Savary, and Duroc with the emperor. Saint was brought in by two gendarmes with his hands tied behind him. He appeared perfectly composed. The presence of Napoleon made not the least impression on him, but he saluted him respectfully. The emperor asked him whether he could speak French, and he replied in a firm tone, "Very little." Napoleon then directed me to ask him, in his name, the following questions. "Where were you born?" "In Naumburg." "What is your father?" "A Protestant minister." "How old are you?" "I am 18 years of age." "What did you intend to do with the knife?" "To kill you." "You are mad, young man. You are an illuminato." "I am not mad, and I know not what is meant by an illuminato." "You are sick, then." "I am not sick. On the contrary, I am in good health." "Why did you wish to assassinate me?" "Because you have caused the misfortunes of my country." "Have I done you any harm?" "You have done harm to me as well as to all Germans." "By whom were you sent? Who instigated you to this crime?" "Nobody. I determined to take your life from the conviction that I should thereby render the highest service to my country and to Europe." "Is this the first time you ever saw me?" "I saw you at Erfurt at the time of the interview." "Did you then intend to assassinate me?" "No, I thought that you would no longer wage war in Germany. I was then one of your most ardent admirers." "How long have you been in Vienna?" 10 days. "Why did you so long defer the execution of your design?" "I came to Schönbrunn a week ago, but the parade was over when I arrived, and I postponed the execution of my design until this day." "I tell you, you are either mad or sick, neither the one nor the other. Desire Corvisart to come here." "Who is Corvisart?" "He is a physician," I replied. "I have no need of him." We remained silent until the doctor arrived. Saint evinced the utmost indifference. At length Corvisart made his appearance. Napoleon directed him to feel the young man's pulse. "Am I not quite well, sir?" "He is in very good health," said the doctor, addressing himself to the emperor. "I told you so," said Saint, with an air of satisfaction. Napoleon was embarrassed by the unconcerned manner of the offender. "You are a wild enthusiast," said he. "You will ruin your family. I am willing to grant your life if you ask pardon for the crime which you intended to commit, and for which you ought to be sorry." "I want no pardon," replied Saint. "I feel the deepest regret for not having executed my design." "You seem to think very lightly of the commission of a crime. To kill you would not have been a crime, but a duty. Whose portrait is that was found upon you?" "It is the portrait of a young lady to whom I am attached. She will be very much distressed to hear of the unhappy situation in which you are placed. She will regret to hear that I have not succeeded. She detests you no less than I do. Would you not be grateful were I to pardon you? I would notwithstanding seize the first opportunity of taking your life." Napoleon was confounded. He ordered the prisoner to be led away, and then entered into conversation with us, and said a great deal on the subject of the Illuminati. In the evening he sent for me and said, "The circumstance that occurred today is very extraordinary. The plots of Berlin and Weimar are at the bottom of this affair." I repelled these suspicions. "Women are capable of anything," resumed Napoleon. "Neither man nor woman connected with those two courts," I replied, "would ever conceive the idea of so atrocious a crime. Recollect the affair of Schill. It bears no resemblance to a crime like this. You may say what you please, General, but I know I am no favorite either at Berlin or Weimar." "That's very true. You cannot reasonably expect to be a favorite at either of those courts. But because they dislike you, does it follow that they would assassinate you?" He communicated the same suspicions. Napoleon ordered me to write to General Lauer, directing him to interrogate Saint, with the view of obtaining some confession from him. But he made none. He persisted in asserting that he had acted entirely from the impulse of his own mind, and not from the instigation of any one. The departure from Schönbrunn was fixed for the 27th of October. Napoleon rose at 5 in the morning and sent for me. We walked out to the great road to see the Imperial Guard pass along on its departure for France. We were alone. Napoleon again spoke to me of Saint. "That a young man of his age," said he, "a German, a Protestant, and well-educated, should attempt the commission of such a crime is a thing unparalleled. Inquire how he died."
Chapter 20.
A heavy fall of rain obliged us to return from our walk. I wrote to General Lauer, requesting that he would give us an account of the last moments of Saint. He informed me that the prisoner had been executed at 7 in the morning of the 27th, that he had taken no sustenance since the 24th, that food had been offered to him, but that he had constantly refused it because, as he said, he had sufficient strength to walk to the place of execution. He was informed that peace was concluded, and this intelligence seemed to agitate him. His last words were, "Liberty forever, Germany forever, death to the tyrant." I delivered the report to Napoleon. He desired me to keep the knife that had been found upon the criminal. It is still in my possession. Napoleon informed me that the preliminaries of the peace were not yet signed, but that the articles of the treaty were all drawn up, and that it would be ratified at Munich, where we were to stop. We arrived at Nymphenburg. The court of Bavaria was residing there at the time. I had not had the honor of seeing the king since the campaign of Austerlitz. He lodged me in his palace and gave me many proofs of his confidence and kindness. He described to me the unhappy situation of his subjects and added that if another state of things were not speedily established, he should be obliged to put the key under the door and set off. These were the expressions he used. I bore this last conversation in mind, for I was determined to report it, not with the view of injuring the king, but for the sake of proving to Napoleon that all the indemnities which he granted to his allies were far from satisfying them and compensating for the burthens imposed on them by the war. Peace was ratified. We left Nymphenburg and arrived at Stuttgart. Napoleon was received in a style of magnificence and was lodged in the palace, together with all his suite. The king was laying out a spacious garden, and men who had been condemned to the galleys were employed to labor in it. The emperor asked the king who the men were who worked in chains. He replied that they were for the most part rebels who had been taken in his new possessions. We set out on the following day. On the way, Napoleon alluded to the unfortunate wretches whom he had seen at Stuttgart. "The King of Wurtemberg," said he, "is a very harsh man, but he is very faithful. Of all the sovereigns in Europe, he possesses the greatest share of understanding." We stopped for an hour at Rastatt, where the Princes of Baden and Princess Stephanie had arrived for the purpose of paying their respects to the Emperor. The Grand Duke and Duchess accompanied him as far as Strasbourg. On his arrival in that city, he received dispatches which again excited his displeasure against the Faubourg Saint-Germain. We proceeded to Fontainebleau. No preparations had been made for the Emperor's reception. There was not even a guard on duty, but shortly after, the whole court arrived, as well as the different members of Napoleon's family. The Emperor had several long conferences with the Minister of Police. He complained of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. The contrast of humility and boldness alternately displayed by the old nobility in the antechambers and saloons disconcerted him. He could scarcely conceive that these men were so base and perfidious as to destroy with the one hand while they solicited favors with the other. He appeared inclined to severity, but Fouché dissuaded him from that course. "It is a traditionary remark," said he, "that the Seine flows, the Faubourg intrigues, solicits, devours, and calumniates. This is in the order of nature. Everything has its attributes." Napoleon yielded. He avenged himself only on men. It was proposed that he should make a solemn entry into the capital, but this he declined. The conqueror of the world was superior to the triumphs which transported the Romans. On the following day, the court left Fontainebleau. The emperor rode to Paris without stirrups. He outstripped all his escort. None but a chasseur of the guard was able to keep up with him. In this manner, he arrived at the Tuileries. Napoleon was now approaching one of the most important epochs of his life.
Chapter 21.
The imperial divorce was publicly spoken of in Paris, but opinions varied with regard to the choice of the future empress. The princesses of Russia and Saxony and the Archduchess of Austria were talked of. The Russian alliance first became the subject of consideration. Monsieur de Metternich learnt this and made overtures which were accepted. All the members of the imperial family were, however, averse to the Austrian alliance. They dreaded the subtlety of the Vienna court and foresaw that it would consent and lend itself to anything the emperor might require, until a favorable opportunity should occur when the mask would be thrown off and Austria would be foremost in bringing about his ruin. But the marriage was determined on, and remonstrances were useless. I was appointed to be present at the ceremony. This was no trifling favor, for a great part of the court was obliged to mingle with the crowd. I must confess, however, that I had no right to expect it, as I had indulged in some reflections on the divorce, which had been reported to the emperor. I felt for Josephine, who had always proved herself amiable, simple, and unassuming. She was banished to Malmaison. I frequently visited her, and she made me the confidant of her sorrows. I have seen her weep for hours together. She spoke of her attachment for Bonaparte, for so she used to call him in our presence. She regretted the close of her splendid career. This was very natural. The day after the marriage, we received orders to attend and make the 3 bows to the imperial couple who were seated on the throne. I could not obey the summons, being confined by a headache, which attacks me pretty regularly every week. I sent to inform the Grand Marshal of this circumstance. Napoleon did not believe I was unwell. He thought I was unwilling to submit to the etiquette, and he was therefore displeased with me. He gave orders that I should return to Dantzic. The Duc de Feltre met me on the boulevards and communicated to me the emperor's intentions. I applied for instructions. Napoleon answered dryly that I had only to keep watch over Prussia, to treat the Russians with respect, and to give an account of what was going on in the ports of the Baltic, adding that I might dispense with passing through Berlin. I stayed a few days at Strasbourg and Frankfurt, and arrived on the 10th of June at Dantzic. I was very well received by the troops and the inhabitants. They complained very much of General Grabowski. The Danzikers did not like him, but they were in the wrong. He was an excellent man. The garrison was soon increased. It received an augmentation of Saxon, Baden, Wurtemberg, Westphalian, and Hessian troops. They formed a complete army. This increase of force displeased me, because it imposed a heavy burden on the citizens. For my own part, I had no reason to complain. The sentiments of the troops were by no means equivocal, and their respective sovereigns, with but few exceptions, seized that opportunity of assuring me of their goodwill. I shall content myself with the insertion of the King of Bavaria's letter. Munich, April 15th, 1811. My dear Rapp, you are about to have my 14th Regiment of Infantry under your command. I recommend it to your kindness and attention. The colonel is a brave man who will fulfill his duty. The lieutenant colonel and the two majors are valuable men, as are all the officers of the regiment. The troops are excellent and in good condition. They are very well pleased, my dear general, to be placed under the command of an officer like you, a noch dazu ein Elsasser, and moreover, a native of Alsace. Address yourself directly to me whenever you may have anything to communicate relative to the welfare of my troop, if you have any complaint to make, or if it fails in the discharge of its duty, a circumstance which I hope will not occur. I eagerly seize this opportunity, my dear Rapp, to repeat to you the assurance of my constant friendship. Maximilian Joseph. I received instructions to close the port of the town and to watch those of Prussia. Davoust came to take the command of Hamburg. I was not under his orders, but I was to correspond with him and with Monsieur de Saint-Marsan. Though I was not acquainted with the latter gentleman, yet I esteemed him greatly. His letters proved him to be a worthy man, who was desirous of seeing harmony restored between the two nations. This was also my wish. Our opinions perfectly agreed. One frequently wrote to advise me not to place confidence in that diplomatist, whom he described as a traitor sold to King William and his ministers. He doubtless wrote to the same effect to Napoleon, but fortunately, when that prince had once formed his opinion with respect to any individual, he paid little attention to the reports that were addressed to him. Nothing short of finding him, as Napoleon himself expressed it, with his hand in his pocket, could induce him to withdraw his confidence. My situation, however, became disagreeable. On the one side, the Dantzicers complained of the maintenance of the troops, of the burthens that were imposed upon them, and of being deprived of their trade. On the other, the ministers urged me to collect the contributions in order to meet the expenses of a secret expedition and the extension of the fortifications. The contractors threatened to stop the supplies. I knew not what to do. I derived some funds from the taxes raised on Prussia, but these were insufficient. However, by dint of perseverance and representations, I succeeded in obtaining the sums necessary for paying the supplies, and by degrees the town was relieved from that burthen. Funds were assigned to me for completing the fortifications and making the necessary preparations for the secret expedition, which, however, was no longer a secret. The French ministers once proposed to Napoleon to have the garrison maintained by the Prussian government. A letter was written to me for my advice on this subject, and I replied that if ever such a determination should be entered into, I would immediately quit Dantzic, in spite of every consideration. I must do justice to Marshal Davoust, who was likewise consulted in this business. He showed that the measure was dangerous and impracticable. The idea was abandoned. I cannot pass over in silence a strange misunderstanding in which I became involved at Dantzic. I gave a dinner to which I invited the Prussian and Russian residents. I placed the former on my right hand and the latter on my left. The Russian resident took offense at this arrangement. He imagined I intended to affront him, the Russian court, and all the Russians in the world. He complained of my conduct, and his complaint was transmitted from St. Petersburg to Monsieur de Champagny, who communicated it to Napoleon. I was blamed. I was said to have been wanting in the respect due to the resident of a great nation in assigning the post of honor to the resident of Prussia, and I was called upon to make reparation for the error I had committed. I confess I felt hurt at this. My reply to the minister was that I did not give diplomatic dinners, that the foreign consuls were not accredited with the governor, but with the Senate, that I might place beside me at my own table whomsoever I pleased, that I conceived the complaints of the resident to be ridiculous, and that I would not receive him again. I kept my word, and here the affair ended. I consider it proper to relate this anecdote because it proves the attempts which were making even at that period to conciliate the good graces of Russia.
Chapter 22.
Nothing could have been more repugnant to the wishes of the Dantzigers than having among them French custom house officers, whom for some time there had been an idea of establishing at Dantzic. I repelled the proposition as strenuously as I possibly could. The presence of these officers would have destroyed the small portion of trade which I still tolerated, notwithstanding the outcries of Napoleon. This measure would have been felt as no less a grievance along the whole coast of the Baltic, which, I frankly confess, I did not watch with the vigilance that was prescribed to me. Complaints were in consequence poured out against me, but I knew from whence they proceeded, and I did not concern myself much about them. Napoleon was, however, enraged at my indulgence. He reproached me for it. "To allow the Prussians and Dantzigers to carry on trade," said he, "is to betray me," wrote to the same effect, and sent spies in every direction. Napoleon became tired of reports and complaints. He directed Bertrand to inform me how much he was dissatisfied with me. That general wrote to me, "The Emperor knows, my dear Rapp, that you permit contraband trade in Prussia and at Dantzic. I must inform you that he is displeased with you," etc. Outcries were raised, but I paid no regard to them, and continued to exercise my power with moderation. The custom house establishment was set on foot. It is well known how severely it was felt, particularly in the conquered countries. The individuals connected with this department in Dantzic aped independence and refused to obey any orders save those of the minister Sucy. In support of these pretensions, reference was made to the example of the custom establishment of Hamburg. I cut the matter short by sending the director of the customs to Weichselmunde, where he underwent 6 days' imprisonment. Such an act of severity was unexampled. It was accounted as great a crime as high treason. The minister complained of it, but, to his great surprise, Napoleon replied that if I had inflicted punishment, I had reasons for doing so. "Besides," said he, "Dantzic is in a state of siege, and in that case a governor is omnipotent." The officers of the customs learnt that they had presumed too much on their credit. They became more circumspect, and behaved themselves better to the Dantzigers. Trade recovered a certain degree of security, which was augmented by my releasing several ships that had been captured by our pirates. Fresh remonstrances were made, but with no better success than before. I received orders to commit all articles of English merchandise to the flames. This measure would have been most disastrous. I evaded it, and notwithstanding the presence of the officers of the customs, Dantzic lost no more than what amounted to 200 francs, and Königsberg still less. I do not speak of the merchandise procured by captures. The continental system and the rigorous measures employed by Napoleon in the north of Germany excited more and more dissatisfaction. The people were exasperated. I was frequently applied to for reports on their situation. I described them such as they really were, oppressed, ruined, and driven to the last extremity. I pointed out those secret societies in which the whole nation was enrolled, where hatred brooded on vengeance, and despair collected and combined her plans. But Napoleon looked upon those societies with contempt. He little knew the character of the Germans. He thought they possessed neither vigor nor energy. He compared them and their pamphlets to those little dogs who bark but dare not bite. At a later period, we learned, by experience, what they were capable of. I was also frequently called upon for reports respecting the affairs of Russia and the army which was assembling at Wilna. I was applied to for my opinion as to what course France or Germany would adopt, in case of an expedition to the other side of the Niemen turning out unfortunate or failing altogether. My answer was literally as follows. It will be difficult to give credit to a prediction which has unfortunately been so fully realized. If your Majesty should experience reverses, you may be assured that the Russians and Germans would all rise in a mass to throw off the yoke. A crusade would be set on foot. All your allies would abandon you. Even the King of Bavaria, on whom you place so much reliance, would join the coalition. I make an exception only in favor of the King of Saxony. He, perhaps, would remain faithful to you, but his subjects would compel him to make common cause with your enemies. Napoleon, as may be supposed, was not well pleased with this communication. He sent it to Marshal Davoust, directing him to peruse it, and to write to inform me that the emperor was greatly astonished that one of his aides-de-camp could have presumed to address such a letter to him, that my reports resembled the pamphlets published on the other side of the Rhine, which I appeared to find pleasure in reading, that, finally, the Germans should never be treated as Spaniards. The marshal executed his commission, and I was for a long time out of favor with Napoleon. Experience has proved whether or not my judgment was correct, and I took the liberty to make that remark to the emperor, as I shall state hereafter. When he obliged the King of Prussia to send to Magdeburg all the prohibited merchandise which had been confiscated at Königsberg, I addressed him in the most urgent tone. I represented to him how much that measure was calculated to excite discontent and to exasperate the nation. Monsieur de Clérambault, who was then consul general, wrote to him in the same strain, but our representations were not attended to. The war with Russia was on the eve of breaking out. Napoleon deliberated as to the course he should pursue with regard to Prussia. To enter into an alliance with King William would not have been the means of subduing the doubts and prejudices of that monarch. To dethrone him would have been a violent measure, but it was one, however, which was advised by many persons whom I will not name. The emperor was urged to deprive the Prussian monarch of his states and to keep possession of them himself. Perhaps William has never yet been made fully acquainted with the danger which threatened him. I knew its full extent. I pitied the King of Prussia and his subjects, and I opposed the design to the utmost of my power. Instructions had already been sent. That general expected to commence his march immediately. What was his astonishment when, instead of an order for invading Prussia, he received information of a treaty of alliance with that country. The intelligence of that event afterwards reached me, and it afforded me great satisfaction.
Chapter 23.
The Grand Army was already on the Vistula. Napoleon quitted Paris, repaired to the capital of Saxony, and thence to Dantzic. He had been preceded by the King of Naples, who had solicited permission to go to Dresden, but without success. The refusal had mortified him exceedingly. He told me that the emperor caused him great vexation and unhappiness. Such at least was his own account. We were the first persons whom the emperor received. He began the conversation with me by a rather odd question. What do these Dantzigers do with their money? They gain a good deal, and I spend a good deal among them. I replied that their situation was far from being prosperous, that they were suffering greatly, in short, that they were at their last gasp. There will be a change soon, he replied, that is agreed upon, but I will keep them to myself. He was fatigued, and in consequence the King of Naples and I withdrew. I was recalled in a moment, and I remained with the emperor while he dressed. He asked me several questions respecting the duty of the fortress. When he was dressed, and his valet de chambre had left the room, he said, "Well, General Rapp, the Prussians have become our allies, and the Austrians will shortly be so too." "Unfortunately, sire," replied I, "we do a great deal of mischief as allies. I receive complaints against our troops from all quarters." "That is merely a passing cloud," said he. "I shall see whether Alexander really intends to go to war. I will avoid it if I can." Then, changing the conversation all at once, he said, "Did you observe how queer Murat looked? He seems ill." I replied, "No, sire, he is not ill, but out of humor." "Why out of humor?" said he. "Is he not satisfied with being a king?" "He says he is not a king." "Why, then, does he act so like a fool? He ought to be a Frenchman, and not a Neapolitan." In the evening, I had the honor to sup with Napoleon, the King of Naples, and the Prince de Neuchâtel. Before we sat down to table, we conversed on the subject of the war with Russia. We were in the saloon. The emperor, suddenly perceiving a marble bust on a bracket, said, "Whose head is that?" "Sire," I replied, "it is the Queen of Prussia's." "So, General Rapp, you keep the bust of the fair queen in your house. She did not like me." "Sire," I replied, "I presume I may be allowed to possess the bust of a pretty woman. Besides, she is the wife of a king who is now your ally." Next morning, we went out on horseback. Napoleon visited the fortress and did not appear satisfied with the works. When he perceived that I was not aware what object displeased him, he flew into a passion and said, before a number of persons, that he did not understand why his governors took upon themselves to act the part of sovereigns, and that he wished his orders to be executed. There had, indeed, been a little deviation from the strict letter of his commands, but it was trifling and was not worth the words that were made about it. The King of Naples said to me, in a low tone of voice, "Do not vex yourself about these reproaches. The emperor is out of temper. He received letters this morning which put him in an ill humor." We afterwards returned home. Napoleon received the generals and officers under my command, as well as the civil authorities. To the latter, he put many questions respecting trade and finances. They deplored the state of their affairs. "It will change soon," said he. "I will keep you to myself. It is a thing determined upon. None but the great families prosper." Then, perceiving Monsieur de Francens the elder, he said, "You do not complain, Monsieur de Francens. Your affairs are in a thriving condition. You have amassed a fortune of at least 10 millions. In the evening, I had again the honor of supping with Napoleon, the King of Naples, and the Prince de Neufchâtel. Napoleon maintained silence for a long time. At length, he suddenly asked how far it was from Dantzic to Cadiz. "Too far, sire," I replied. "Ah, I understand you, General," said he, "but we shall be further off a few months hence." "So much the worse," I added. The King of Naples and the Prince de Neufchâtel did not speak a word. "I see, gentlemen," said Napoleon, "that you do not wish for war. The King of Naples does not like to leave his beautiful kingdom. Berthier wishes to hunt at Gros Bois, and General Rapp longs to be back to his superb hotel in Paris." "I must confess," I observed, "sire, that your Majesty has not spoiled me. I know very little of the pleasures of the capital." Murat and Berthier continued to observe profound silence. They seemed to be piqued at something. After dinner, they told me that I had done right to speak, as I did to Napoleon. "But," replied I, "you should not have allowed me to speak alone."
Chapter 24.
Napoleon quitted Dantzic and proceeded to Königsberg. Murat accompanied him, and General Belliard was also there. He spoke to them a great deal about Spain and his brother, with whom he was dissatisfied. General Flahaut returned from a mission on which he had been sent to Prince Schwarzenberg. He rendered an account of the devotedness of the prince and of his impatience to attack the Russians. The emperor did not appear to place perfect reliance on the sincerity of the prince. However, he allowed himself to be persuaded that, at length, his protestations might become sincere and that benefits might inspire sentiments of gratitude. He explained his plan and intentions as follows. "If Alexander," said he, "persists in his refusal to execute the conventions which we have mutually entered into, if he will not accede to the last proposals I made him, I will pass the Niemen, defeat his army, and possess myself of Russian Poland. This last territory I will unite to the Grand Duchy. I will convert it into a kingdom where I will leave 50,000 men whom the country must support. The inhabitants wish to form themselves again into a national corps. They are a warlike people and will soon possess a numerous and disciplined force. Poland wants arms. I will supply them. She will be a check upon the Russians, a barrier against the eruptions of the Cossacks. But I am embarrassed on one point. I know not what course to adopt with regard to Galicia. The Emperor of Austria, or rather his council, is reluctant to part with it. I have offered ample compensation for it, but it has been refused. I must await the course of events, which alone can show us what ought to be done. Poland, if well organized, may furnish 50,000 cavalry. What say you, General Belliard?" "I think so, sire," replied the general. "If your Majesty would mount the infantry of the Vistula on horseback, it would make excellent light cavalry and might thus be successfully opposed to the cloud of Cossacks which precede the Russian forces." The emperor said, "We shall see what can be done. You will return with Murat and leave your Swiss. By the by, what do you think of the Swiss?" "They will march, sire. They will fight. They have improved greatly. They would not be known for the same troops that they were 6 weeks ago. I will go and see them tomorrow." "Well," observed the emperor, "rejoin Murat and inspect all the cavalry in company with him." The proposals which the emperor had spoken of were not accepted. The Russians complained of our forces and our commercial measures, and they required that we should evacuate Germany. We marched forward and arrived on the banks of the Niemen, which 5 years before had been the scene of our victories. The troops raised shouts of joy. Napoleon proceeded to the advanced posts, disguised as a chasseur, and reconnoitered the banks of the river, in company with General Axo. He afterwards spoke for a few moments with the King of Naples, pointing out to him the points at which it would be proper to throw bridges over the river, and directing him to concentrate his troops in order that the passage might be rapidly effected. The cavalry was mounted, the infantry was under arms. Never was there a grander spectacle. Eble set to work. The pontoons were laid at midnight. At 1 o'clock we were on the right bank of the Niemen, and General Pagel was at Kausno, which had been evacuated by Bagawauth, and we took possession of it without striking a blow. We continued to press on. We marched incessantly, but we perceived only a few polks of Cossacks blending with the line of the horizon. We arrived at Wilna and found its immense magazines in flames. We extinguished the fire, and the greater part of the provisions were saved.
This concludes today's reading of the Memoirs of General Rapp, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapters, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.